Good evening, everyone. So I ask you to go back and reread the beginning of Matthew chapter 13, the parable of the sower, and then there's an intervening section, and then Jesus explains the parable. So, as we get started tonight, I want to share with you a model for approaching the parables that my friend and colleague Bart Bruler uses with our students at Indiana Wesleyan. And he calls it the 4 C's of parable interpretation. There are 4 elements that we look at every time we approach a parable, and they all start with the letter C. They are context, comparison, the core, or the central message of the parable, and then the crazy. And there's no parable of Jesus that doesn't have this crazy element. We've talked about this before. The parables are a bit subversive. They kind of sneak up on us with their seeming simplicity that kind of bursts on our awareness with complexity and oftentimes with challenge. So context, comparison, core, and crazy. And this parable of the sower, in Mark's gospel, it's the first of the kingdom parables. And here in Matthew, it's not the first, but it's the beginning of a series of parables about the kingdom. So let's just identify what the 4 C's are for this particular parable, the parable of the sower. The first C is context. When is it that Jesus tells this parable and in what kind of setting? Well, if you back up to the end of chapter 12, we'll see that Jesus has just had some hard conversations. He had a hard conversation with the Pharisees who came to him seeking a sign because they were refusing to see what was right in front of them. And Jesus had some pretty hard words to say to them, calling them an evil generation. And then at the very end of chapter 12, Jesus has some hard words for his biological family. They come to him trying to get to see him, and he just kind of uses them as a sermon illustration. And we see that Jesus is redefining the central loyalty that will provide identity for his followers. It's no longer going to be the biological family that is the first or the frontline loyalty, if you will, but the family of followers of Jesus, what we come to call later the church, is going to now be the first line, front line place of loyalty. And that was hard for Jesus' family to hear. And then at the very beginning of chapter 13, Matthew sets the narrative stage. Jesus is talking to a large crowd. And so we're dealing with a context in which there is a lack of true capacity to see or a lack of disposition to see. And so there's a need for parables. Jesus will talk about that in between the parable and the explanation of the parable. We'll hear a lot about why Jesus uses parables. And we get the clue to that at the end of the parable. Oh, excuse me. At the end of the parable of the sower, in verse 9, Jesus says that little cryptic phrase, "Let anyone who has ears listen." Or as the old King James says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." So we see as Jesus uses parables that it's not so much about physical hearing as it is about the disposition of one's heart to hear. And we're going to see that understanding and hearing parables has less to do with our intellectual capacity and more to do with the orientation of our heart. So that's the context in which Jesus tells this parable. What is the central comparison that's being made? Parables are comparisons. A is like B. Well, there are really 2 comparisons that are central to this parable. One is that the seed in the parable is the message about the kingdom of God. And the soils in the parable represent or symbolize different kinds of reception of the message of the kingdom. Now, we'll talk about the sower a little bit later. That comparison is left very ambiguous. Who is the sower in this parable? Is it Jesus? Is it God? Is it the apostles? Is it anyone who takes the message of the kingdom anywhere? And Jesus leaves that a bit ambiguous. So we'll come back to that. So the central comparison is seed and the message of the kingdom, soils, and the different receptivity or receptions of the word. So what's the core message of this parable? Well, it seems to be that the kingdom of God, when that message is sown on good soil, the fruitfulness of that message will be absolutely astonishing. The kingdom of God, the message of the kingdom of God, when it's sown or implanted in good soil, will be fruitful. Fruitful in capital letters. And verse 23, Jesus characterizes what that kind of receptivity is. He says, the one sown, or the seed sown on good ground, this is the one who hears and understands. And that word understanding is used 6 times in Matthew chapter 13. So hearing, the actual physical act of hearing the message, is paired with understanding. And understanding in the context of Matthew 13, as I said already, seems to flow not from someone's intellectual capacity, but from the disposition of their heart. The good soil is the person who is positioned, postured, ready, willing to receive the message of the kingdom. So context, comparison, and core bring us to that 4th element, the crazy. And there's a double dose of crazy in this parable. In fact, this parable is framed inside 2 really crazy elements. First of all, there's the method of sowing that's employed here by this sower. The sower goes out and sows, and you get this picture of this reckless, profligate scattering of seed, precious seed, in places that it's illogical or even inhospitable to sow seed. Now, think about the audience. These are subsistence farmers. These are people who carefully hoard and store and guard a small portion of each year's harvest to be the seed that they will sow for the next year's harvest. So seed was precious. It was a precious commodity. And you looked for the best, most well-prepared soil as the place to sow this precious and limited commodity. So this picture of someone just taking that precious seed and scattering it on rocky soil, hard soil, thorny ground would have absolutely shocked Jesus' listeners. And then at the end of the parable, Jesus talks about the fruitfulness of seed sown on good soil being 100-fold, or 60, or 30. Well, these farmers could maybe stretch their imagination to visualize a 30-fold return on their seed. But 60 or 100, that is just crazy. It's unimaginable fruitfulness. As Eugene Peterson puts it in The Message, this is a harvest beyond the farmer's wildest dreams. So this parable is framed inside some really crazy elements, some really shocking elements for Jesus' listeners. So as we think about all of this for our own lives, I want to just touch on 3 points for reflection this week. First is our disposition, the posture of our hearts. Do we have ears to hear Jesus' kingdom message? Even if, perhaps I should say, even when it messes with our own pre-understanding of how we think things should work, when it messes with our cherished notions of what the kingdom is, are we willing to hear with ears that are attuned to Jesus' voice, even when it says something crazy. And that goes then to my second point, and that is soil care. I've been out working in my flower beds, and some of the things that come up from year to year don't need a whole lot of attention from me. They are going to be fruitful, more fruitful than I would like them to be in the case of the cosmos, that are going to come back no matter what I do. But some things, the soil needs to be tended, a little compost worked in, a little bone meal worked in around the irises, a little loosening of the hard clumps of soil. And so, what kind of soil care needs to be done in my life so that I am good soil, receptive soil, able to receive the kingdom message and to produce fruit? What kind of cultivating or weeding or watering needs to be done in my heart in this season? And then I want us to think about that extravagant sowing. I really think that the sower in this parable is God himself. And if God himself is willing to just scatter seed, even in inhospitable, rocky, thorny places, then maybe I need to think about my own context. Who are the thorny hearts or the hard hearts or the inhospitable hearts in the people around me? And am I willing to sow the kingdom message even there? Even if I'm not guaranteed a return, even if fruitfulness seems like a distant possibility. These are some areas for us to think about this week. I would encourage you to keep reading the parable of the sower. You might want to spend some time in the Message version of that parable this week. And as you have new insights and understandings, share them here so that we can have a conversation together about them. God bless you.